This is Resident 104.4 FM, flipping marvellous as always. I'm Nick Hennigan and welcome to another edition of Literary London, where we talk about things, well, literary and kind of Londony. Except today, I'm pleased to say that we're going to be talking Literary London with a distinctly Irish twist. So I'd like to welcome once more Cathal Dallat, who's becoming a bit of an old friend to this programme, really, Cathal. You've been on a few times talking about various things. And we're going to talk this time about W.B. Yeats, who, the great Irish poet who was effectively brought up in the UK and specifically in our part of town in West London. I should also say as well, if you're near YouTube, you can catch this on the Maverick Theatre Company YouTube account. You can also catch this on bohemianbritain.com, and it will be also podcast as well. Now, I mention that because we're actually, as I've done a few times with most of the shows, actually since lockdown, we're recording this as well. We're recording a video of this. And later on, I'm going to ask Cathal to show us some photos of a very special artwork that's been created. So, first of all, hello again, Cathal. How are you doing?
Hi, Nick. Good to see you again, and good to be on the channel again.
How's your end of lockdown going?
Well, interestingly, lots of things have expanded. I mean, poetry. One of the things that we love about poetry and love about poetry in West London, where we were involved, my wife Anne-Marie Fife, poet, was running Coffee House Poetry at the Troubadour for many years, and that was the ultimate cellar club in London. It had been folk and poetry, but it was very much poetry from our point of view. And we thought with all of that becoming inaccessible, somehow one would lose the great sort of collective enjoyment of poetry. But of course, moving on to Zoom, and we had a poet, Naomi Shihab Nye, a Palestinian-American poet, last night, talking to her from our house here in Chiswick with an audience of 100 people who are poets, not just the crowd who used to come to Coffee House Poetry in the Troubadour, but poets in Minneapolis and Montreal and New Zealand, 5 o'clock in the morning, getting up to enjoy poetry. And collectively, of course, in a Zoom, you're looking at all those faces that you used to see in the audience, and some that we would never have seen in a London audience. So that and the summer school that we run in Ireland, which is named after a local poet from the Glens of Antrim, the John Hewitt International Summer School, again with a video all online last summer. This summer hybrid, so there will be a real presence there, plus video. So poetry seems to survive in a way that lots of other larger groupings have had difficulty with, But and poetry workshops, of course, have gone on Zoom, by email. All that communication is still there, and perhaps reaching out much wider. So, yeah, strange not to be in a crowd listening to a poet speak, and yet great to be on a screen and having that conversation and hearing the poems.
Yeah, you do kind of get the impression that it's changed the landscape. And I know certainly some meetings and I've been doing these creative producer workshops, and we've had people from South Africa involved, which would never have happened had we done them in Soho, which was the original plan. And you get the impression that some of the meetings I've got arranged for the autumn are going to be a hybrid. So there'll be the live element, but also the sort of Zoom element too.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the arts are getting used to that. Business had been using it for conferencing for years, although people did still fly all over the world and use up air miles and fuel. But nonetheless, lots of businesses were talking daily to India or Los Angeles or whatever, and had got used to that. And I think in the arts, we said, oh no, we're too special for that. You have to be there. You have to be present. Well, you do and you don't. There will be different situations that we adapt to, like everything. And of course, so much has changed in the last 15 months. What the new normal is still got to really be defined.
Yes, it's very interesting. I went to the I went to the Bush Theatre. Funny enough, to see this called Harm. I'm just holding the book up now, the script up to the camera, which was a one-person play by Phoebe Claire Powell. And interestingly, I've not yet seen it, but the BBC have made a version of it for their BBC 4 had a thing called Lights Up, a season called Lights Up, and it'd be very interesting to see how they do it. I had an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, which I wrote. It's actually based on an old Charles Dickens script that he wrote himself, and that sort of toured America last year, and it's been to Italy and it's been the UK. This year they did a video version at Nottingham, and it was very kind of weird because I directed this thing as well as adapted it. It was very weird thinking in televisual terms or Zoom terms, but it turned out to be, it worked quite well, worked very well. In fact, they did a grand job. And so talk about just a bit about yourself, Cathal, because obviously we've chatted a bit. You're in what some people will call the most literary part of London, Chiswick, which is something from the book festival has sort of started with, and Torrin Douglas, who's a champion of all that. But just talk about your own background. Whereabouts in Ireland are you from originally, and how long have you been here for?
Well, I'm from the Glens of Antrim. I've been here since the 70s. I mean, I was at Queen's in Belfast, which is the university from which some of the greatest poets of our time have come, including Seamus Heaney, Paul Muldoon, Maeve McGurky, and there was a whole generation. I came here and I'd been interested in Yeats all through school. In fact, although I say I'm from the Glens of Antrim, my grandfather was from Belfast, but he in turn had come from Sligo. So which is where Yeats's maternal grandfather lived. In fact, from the same little village, Ballysadair, just outside Sligo, where Yeats's maternal grandfather lived. So I'd kind of grown up with a Yeats myth, and I came to London looking for work in the IT world. In fact, I'd done an IT degree at Queen's, although I spent more time at poetry readings probably than I did in what was then a computer lab. Can you imagine somewhere being called a computer lab? There's more power in this laptop in front of me than there was in the entire computer lab in Belfast. So I spent a number of years in IT, always writing poems. Eventually, not just publishing poems, but getting involved in writing reviews for the Times Literary Supplement, for The Guardian, and then being asked to be a regular contributor on BBC Radio 4's Saturday Review, which was great fun for a number of years. It's a lot less fun now in lockdown because Saturday Review doesn't have any opening nights. It doesn't have film screenings until film theatres pick up again. So the past 15 months has been very quiet, but it was a chance about once a month to go out and look at the latest with a group of 4 other panelists, to go along to a film, a play, read a book, go to an exhibition and see the latest museum or whatever, and then sit around the Saturday evening for 45 minutes talking about it. So, I mean, I loved that life and the exposure to all the arts, but it was poetry primarily that I was interested in terms of my own art, and a number of poets that I've particularly been involved with, championing, studying, and so on. And that's kind of being a poetry organizer, along with my wife, as I said, who's a poetry organizer and was chair of the Poetry Society. So we both kind of done that kind of work. Spend about until 2020, we're spending about the first half of the year in America because there's a great interest there in poetry and Irish poetry. So we were either on tours. Anne-Marie was writing a book, which I think, Nick, you came along to the event and talked about Anne-Marie's book, No Far Shore, which was about coasts she'd grown up on, and coasts of Scotland, coasts of America and Canada. So that took us one spring in America, another spring in researching in Texas, another one as writers in residence at a university in North Carolina. So we spent a lot of time in America, but in the meantime, of course, all our arts organizing was going on here, both in terms of events and in terms of this Yeats project in West London.
Yes, and if you want to see that Anne-Marie's interview, the chat that we had, that's also going to be on. It's on the LondonLiteraryPubCrawl.com website podcast page, and it's going to be on. I lose track. It's going to be on BohemianBritain.com. I think next week they're starting to put some of my old archive stuff on. So it's lovely. It's a brilliant, beautiful book. So I mean, I love talking to writers, and I love talking to you as well, Carl. And we could talk forever about what got you going. But I know specifically you're kind of busting, and I completely understand. You've really created this monster in West London, which is to raise huge amounts of money to put up the first kind of proper tribute to WB8. So just tell us where this madness started, where you've already mentioned the Yeats thing, and where you are and what's actually planned. And I know we've got some photos as well, so I'll ask you for some photos in a bit.
I'll come to those. I mean, the genesis of the idea. So you mentioned Bohemian Britain there. It's a great title, and one of the great things about Bedford Park, which is, if anyone looks at it when they get off at Turnham Green Tube, it's a bunch of red brick houses in retro Queen Anne style, built between 1880, 1876, say, and 1890 something, built very deliberately to attract an arty clientele. So people can list all the artists, illustrators, watercolorists, etc., who lived in Bedford Park. And in fact, the property developer, Jonathan Carr from Dublin, who was an Irishman, built by Irish labour, but his brother was the director of the Grosvenor Gallery. So they had naturally had a number of artists that they wanted to say, there's this new village being built, this quaint village out on the river in Chiswick, out in the countryside, of course, as Chiswick was then, but you could still get into town to see your sitters and to see your patrons by tube, because the tube had just come along. So they built this wonderful place, and they built it as a self-conscious bohemia. A bit of a utopia as well, because it was pastoral. It was the opposite of what smoky Victorian London was. And one of the people who was attracted to that was a chap called John Butler Yeats, who had done a law degree at Trinity, surprisingly, but had decided to chuck it all up and become an artist. Well, that's the essence of bohemia, isn't it? Giving up a good career in the law to come to London. And he had a 2-year-old son at that stage, Willie. So he and his wife came to London, moved in various places. He wasn't terribly successful, one has to say. But one day he heard from some of his artist friends that they were building this village out at Chiswick. And he heard, and this doesn't, the reality doesn't always match up when you're buying off plan in a housing development, but he heard there was going to be a wall all around it so nobody else could get in, a little bit fanciful, and it was going to have its own, there were going to be no newspapers allowed in, so they would live in this completely wonderful commune. In fact, there is no wall, Donald Trump and John Butler Yeats discovered there is no wall, but it's still a beautiful place. But what happened, of course, as with everything, is there's a magic moment. And in that period, William Butler Yeats, so the Yeatses moved here when Willie was about 11 or 12. He went to Godolphin School, which was a boys' school then. People may be surprised to hear that. And they loved that first house. He was playing among all the brickworks, talking to the Irish labourers, and his father was meeting all these wonderful people who were artists and political thinkers and historians and so on. So the Yeatses then, I think they ran out of money, went back to Dublin for a couple of years, came back again when Yeats was 20-ish, and that is really the magic time in his life. So he, in one particular house, which is a couple of hundred yards from where I'm sitting, he wrote the Lake Isle of Innisfree. He was inspired by Chiswick 8, which is an 8, for anybody who doesn't know, spelled E-Y-O-T, and is a Saxon word for an islet or a river island. So there's this little island in the middle of the river, and when Yeats went down there, it reminded him of an island in the lake, Lake Gill, Loch Gill, in Sligo, so where he spent his summers, because like many migrant families, of course, they were constantly popping back to the grannies to spend a couple of months there when funds ran out, or for the summer months or whatever. In fact, his brother Jack, Ireland's greatest modern painter, spent most of his young years up to age 7 in Sligo because the mother couldn't cope with his family and the financial pressures and so on. So they're not a terribly well-off family, but they're tremendously talented. And this father, who's a painter, gives them great ideas and a great sense of themselves. So when Willie's back here in his 20s, he writes the Lake Isle of Innisfree. He writes a lot of poems influenced by the arts and crafts movement, because the whole place had been developed on arts and crafts lines, which meant putting art into everyday life, putting aesthetics into manufacturing. So he's influenced by that. He's influenced by Walt Whitman's poetry, which everybody in Bedford Park apparently loved at that time. It was the new thing. Some of his neighbours come and ask him to write a play for their little girl, and he writes a play called Land of Heart's Desire, as he says, with my Irish theatre in mind. And from that, he eventually develops the Abbey Theatre. Now, I have to be careful what I say here, because one of my committee members on this project is a great-grandson of Frank Fay, who founded the Abbey Theatre. Well, Willie Yeats and Frank Fay both founded the Abbey Theatre, but so there are these complicated histories. So this was a magical time in his life. And what intrigued me about it was that he's not merely somebody who lived in Bedford Park, as one might say, Philip Larkin lived in this house in Hull for 3 years or 20 years, but he was a product of Bedford Park. That bohemian, utopian thing created Willie Yeats. Of course, Ireland made him. I don't take away from that. He loved the landscape, the legends and the lore, but it was in Bedford Park that he could bounce off other writers. He could get his plays published. His next door neighbour, for goodness sake, Elkin Matthews, published the Yellow Book. He was, if you're going to send poems off to somebody, popping them into the house next door is pretty fearful, because I can't imagine Elkin Matthews coming back and saying, Willie, I don't like it, and having to face Willie's father, who would say, you're publishing. So, it was a great communal, progressive, egalitarian neighbourhood middle class, of course, and arty and all that. So they weren't the poorest of the poor, but they supported each other and they supported Willie Yeats. So that idea has always been at the back of my head. And for years, I've been taking people for literary walks, as you know, Nick, and I've taken not just local people as part of the Bedford Park Festival, but ambassadors and American academics and actors and poets and American students year after year on this walk, which takes in William Morris's house. You can see the logic of that because all the arts and crafts stuff was happening there. Lily Yeats, Willie's sister, worked for May Morris for a long time, embroidering golden and silver cloths. So that comes into our story. Chiswick 8, of course, and Chiswick Churchyard, and then back up to Bedford Park and explaining how the whole thing grew and how it involved G.K. Chesterton, Camille Pissarro, John Todd Hunter, Florence Farr, George Bernard Shaw. The whole of literary London was focused in this wonderful little place. So I've been doing those walks for a long time. And at Yeats 2015, so Yeats's 150th birthday, we still talk as if he was with us, but Yeats's 150th birthday in 2015, we had Fergal Keane along at our Bedford Park Festival Poetry Evening, and he sang the Sally Gardens and he talked about Yeats. And at a chat at the end, he just said, why isn't there anything around here? And I said, well, there's the walks, and I've done lectures all over the world on Yeats, Bedford Park, but why isn't there something? And so that all started then, and it's kind of rolled on from there.
Because there is actually, there's a blue plaque where he used to live. But so the other thing about, as you said, how W.B. Yeats kind of was made here, and he's the only, is it right? He's the only award-winning, the only poet brought up in London to win a Nobel Prize.
He's the only poet brought up in Britain to win a Nobel Prize. A very odd thing, but although Harold Pinter has a Nobel Prize, but we think of Pinter as a dramatist rather than a poet. And of course, Yeats wrote some plays, but we think of him as a poet rather than a dramatist. So as a poet, Yeats is and other English writers have won the Nobel Prize for literature, but as a poet, Yeats is the only poet brought up in England to win the Nobel Prize, and nobody's quite clocked that yet. Well, they have in the past few months because I've been going on about it ever so slightly.
But Pinter's another Chiswick resident as well, isn't he? He used to live on the Pinter, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, he used to live. So what was the moment? Because you've now got these plans for this incredible artwork. So where was so it was Fergal that sort of pushed you out.
That evening was a big decision. What I did then was I went that summer to Sligo, to the Yeats Summer School in Sligo, which I'd been to before, and of course we'd gone to family holidays in Sligo because of the family connection. But I went there and talked to the people who run an annual summer school, which brings together all the academics from all over the world, and a great number of them are interested in the London side of Yeats as much as the Irish side of Yeats. Everybody knows the Irish side of Yeats, so that was a key point. I went to visit Dan Mulhall, who was the Irish ambassador in London. He's since moved to Washington, which has been very useful because he invited us over there to do a launch of this project in Washington. But his successor, Adrian O'Neill, again is passionate about the project, because for both of those ambassadors, it's talking about the complexity of the relationship between Ireland and Britain. And it often gets kind of characterized as a kind of an opposition almost, particularly since Brexit. There's been all this, Ireland's trying to do this, England's trying to do that. Whereas the cultural relationship has been constant, flowing, common travel area, people coming and migrating, whether it's the Yeatses or the people who built the houses that the Yeats lived in, and whether it's playwrights like Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, Richard Sheridan, Oliver Goldsmith. Sometimes you find it hard to think of a playwright who wasn't Irish, actually, but yes, there are some. There's a chap called Shakespeare, but there's wonderful connection. And of course, that connection is still there with writers and with plays and with poetry. But on the political level, you could lose sight of it. So I think it's wonderful that this rather, beautifully conserved garden suburb, first garden suburb in the world, and that has a whole history of its own as to how it influenced garden cities, garden suburbs, housing development. That this rather conserved and maybe almost conservative place now is remembering its radical progressive history, and the fact that it welcomed an Irish exile family, the fact that somebody from an Irish exile family in West London today, as 120 years ago, 150 years ago, can grow up and become a Nobel Prize winner is something of value. And the reason I say that's of value is Hounslow Council recognise that if you look at what migrant families bring to London, not just the Yeatses, but ever since, from all the different waves of migration that wash up, if you like, on our shores, that bring in some refreshment, that people who come to London bring something of their own culture and revitalize the capital. But they also use the capital's institutions, the press, the theaters, the poetry groups, the orchestras, the opera, and so on. They use those to develop their own culture, and as Yeats did in no uncertain terms, and various other writers from the Indian subcontinent, from the Caribbean, and so on, have come to London and developed their own culture and gone back and said, "This is who we are. I got this published in London, but it's actually about us back here." And that's Yeats' story in a way, because he was a foot in the door in London, because he'd grown up there, and so his influence in terms of the arts was very powerful.
I suppose Dylan Thomas as well did a similar thing, if perhaps not quite as
absolutely,
quite to the degree that Yeats did. So you've got this idea for this. Tell us about what you're trying to do. It's a fantastic
so it's quite difficult to say to an artist, "I want something that celebrates not
what
just."
What was the process? Did you think, right, it needs to be an artwork? Because you know there's a blue plaque. So what was the process?
It needed to be an object that people could see, that people passing on the train would go, whether they'd heard of Bedford Park or not, "What's that thing? It's absolutely beautiful. I want to get off the train and see it," or "I'm commuting every day. I must come up here on Saturday and look at it," or "I'm coming in from Heathrow because I'm an academic who's just flown in from Seoul in South Korea, and I want to know what that thing is and discover what's around there." And people would come to it. And I mean, there's more to the process. Once you see the artwork, you've got to see all around Bedford Park. It will tell you on signage what the various local places are. There'll be a button you can click, pick up a QR code, and find all the places on your mobile phone. Hear a little Yeats poem read at this or that place. But all of that depends on getting people to get off the train or make Bedford Park a destination. And so it had to be a thing. And we said artwork, but it wasn't going to be a statue. I think statues are rather kind of, it's just a person, isn't it? And it's not as, and it also had to express his youth. I didn't want the Senator Yeats. I didn't want the grand old man with the big hat and the cape parading and saying, I'm famous. We wanted the young Yeats. We wanted the upsurge. We wanted something that represented Yeats springing from the ground of Bedford Park, because it was an artificially created bohemia, utopia, pastoral scenario, was tree-lined. It was a little bit of countryside in London, and that is what propelled him upwards. And I wanted to see also Bedford Park's ideas and ideals, progressive, suffragist, feminist, vegetarian, a lot of them, egalitarian, post-colonial, anti-imperial, springing up from the ground. And that process was kind of fascinating, because we got all the help we could get from the embassy in terms of, we can do you a great launch, and we've been talking to various artists about this. The one person who seemed to have that exuberance in their art for me was Conrad Shawcross, who created the brilliant Paradigm at the Crick Building, which is much, much higher than we're going. He created the Optic Cloak at Greenwich, which takes sort of a functional building and builds a great dazzling piece on top of it. He had done the sunlight thing in the Royal Academy courtyard. So he was in the right area. He was also very interested in science. His things tend to be angular, psychogeometries he talks about. And of course, Yeats, and this will surprise people, was more interested in and much better at science at Godolphin School than he was at English, art, literature, Latin, or any of those things. So I think and we want to inspire kids locally to be either a great poet or a great scientist. So Conrad had fascinated me for some time. So we started coming over here, met the committee, met the local vicar, met people from the Bedford Park Society, went on the walk with me, which, Nick, takes quite a long time. It can take longer and longer the more I talk. So he did the walk, and he understood both what the arts and crafts movement was trying to do, which is to put something beautiful into everyday life. And at the launch at the Irish Embassy, he heard a friend of ours, the National Theatre actor Kieran Hines, read a Yeats poem. Now, Kieran has been in The Terror, anybody who's watched that, or Game of Thrones. He was, I don't know the names, but Mance Rayder in the Game of Thrones. He was in Rome, but he's been in lots of Brian Friel plays and lots of Irish plays. He was in translations recently at the National Theatre. So Kieran read a poem called He Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven. And it's a poem in which Yeats was intrigued by the fact that William Morris and May Morris and his own sister, Lily Yeats, were embroidering very medieval garments, medieval cloths. I mean, when I first came to Bedford Park, lots of people still had these tapestries hanging in their studios. So this idea of embroidered cloths, illuminated cloths with gold and silver woven in. So Yeats writes this poem, "Had I the heavens embroidered cloths enwrought with golden and silver light." I won't do it the way Kieran Hines did it, and I won't do it justice. And Conrad latched on to the golden and silver light and saw that this thing springing up from the ground had to be the gold and silver light of Yeats's illumination, of his genius, of his poetry, coming up from the pastoral ground of Bedford Park. And so he went home and looked at the poem. He'd read all of Yeats during this time. And he also was fascinated by something Yeats talked about gyres, about how society moves in cycles and spins and centuries and movements and so on. And so he got quite involved in that and came up with something that was following his own developmental path in psychogeometries, which was about helical tetrahedral shapes, and actually expressed not just gold and silver light, but the whole idea. In fact, and I'll describe it for those who are. But can I show you that?
Yeah, I'll just say, yes, you've got a picture here, haven't you? Which
so if we just take a look at that, and that briefly is Conrad, but we'll look at this first, which is, as you can see, it's a spiral. It's the sense of something rising up. G.K. Chesterton said of Bedford Park, it wasn't so much that, you remember John Butler Yeats thought there would be a wall to protect this little environment from outsiders. But G.K. Chesterton said it wasn't that the world had come in and conquered Bedford Park, it was that Bedford Park had gone out and conquered the world. So in that spiral, you can see that Bedford Park's ideas, post-colonial, suffragist, egalitarian, became the blueprint for the 20th century, spiraled out into the world. But you can also see
a sort of gold spiral. How tall is that? Would it be about?
That's 4.5 meters. So that's and anybody who sees the picture can see that people will be looking up at it, because we want it to be uplifting. I thought of the Yeats line, "He bade his soul fly upwards," and this bids you, if you're just on the way to the train, you're late for school, you're coming back with bags of shopping, you're still going to look up and be uplifted by this spiral that's reaching up into the sky. So I mean, that's it. If you look at the base, engraved around there in golden letters are, enwrought with gold and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night, and the light and the half light. And Conrad's idea is that not to use gold and silver only, because as the seasons change and as the day changes and the street lights change, you will get blue and dim and half light and light. So it will have that sense of shifting of all the different lights that Yeats was looking for, and genius.
Yeah, I mean, it looks gorgeous, doesn't it? I mean, I'm aware of the fact that we're quite short on time, really. So you've got to find quite a bit of money for this, though.
Yes, I mean, the idea was the total cost is 134,000. So so the total cost is 134,000.
And you've launched a fundraising campaign.
Yes, we launched a fundraising campaign. Just right. So,
just give me the details if you've got. Where can people find out more?
Yeah. So we of the 134,000, we've raised 114,000 already. We've had grants from the London Borough of Hounslow, from the Royal Academy, and from the Josephine Hart Poetry Foundation, and from the Irish Embassy. We've had a £15,000 grant from them. So at the minute, we've only another 20,000 to raise, and people, of course, can go and look at this, at the images. They can look at, if I just stop sharing screen there, does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sure. So, so they can look at it at www.yeatsbedfordpark.com. I'm sure you'll put that on the YouTube version at the end. They can find the story on Twitter under @YeatsBedfordPark. That's @YeatsBedfordPK, just to get it to fit into Twitter. And from the website, they can find the crowdfunding platform and just see how many people, and they're poets, they're local residents, they're actors, they're celebrities. It's been a wonderful sort of confirming upsurge of support for the idea of celebrating, oddly, Ireland's national poet in the middle of London.
Brilliant. That's it. We've run out of time, but thank you so much, Cal, for talking about that. If you want to know any more details, you can see this on the Maverick Theatre YouTube channel. You can also see it on bohemianbritain.com. We're waving to you now, actually. And if you'd like to get in touch, as always, radio@mavericktheatre.co.uk is probably the easiest. But thank you very much again, Cal. I'm Nick Hennigan. This is Literary London on Resonance 104.4 FM.